What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I have to apologize. My channel's been dormant for far too long, but I've been doing some summer traveling. Then I got sick. I'm not quite 100% again, but I'm ready to get back in action. And today I want to talk a bit about Jacob's Ladder. A remake of Jacob's Ladder is being released theatrically tomorrow, which gave me the kick in the ass I needed to start doing something I've been meaning to do a lot more of on this channel, namely celebrating the great movies of the past. While not a runaway commercial success when first released, the original Jacob's Ladder from 1990 had a massive impact on me at age 14 when I first saw it in the theater. 29 years later, the movie's still being talked about, and I think at this point the movie's become an undeniable cult classic. If you haven't seen it, this is an incredibly difficult movie to discuss without giving away major spoilers, so for starters, I'll just try and sell the unconverted on seeing it before I dive into anything really juicy. First and foremost, this is director Adrian Lyne's personal favorite of all the movies he's directed. I've been calling him Lynn for years, but apparently it's correctly pronounced Lyne. In any event, in the 1980s, Adrian Lyne was one of the hottest directors in the business. In 1983, he directed the smash hit Flashdance, which he then followed up with two of the sexiest movies of the 1980s, the intensely erotic 9.5 Weeks starring Mickey Rourke and Kim Basinger, and then Fatal Attraction, a thriller starring Glenn Close and Michael Douglas, the first movie I ever had to sneak into with my buddy since we couldn't find an adult who was willing to take us. Also, I should admit that I find it rather depressing that in the 1980s, a filmmaker could actually realistically achieve mainstream Hollywood success directing wildly sexual movies geared toward an adult sensibility, whereas today's Hollywood feels horrifyingly puritanical and celibate by comparison. In any event, Adrian Lyne was flying very high in his career, but after reading piles upon piles of screenplays that were floating around Hollywood at the time, he was really struggling to find a screenplay that grabbed his interest until he came upon a terrifying screenplay by Bruce Joel Rubin, a writer who was about to pop in a big way with his script for Ghost. The script was called Jacob's Ladder, but it also had an alternate title of Dante's Inferno, which should give you some idea of the content of the story. Jacob's Ladder had been stuck in development hell for years, with several prominent directors attached to direct, including legends like Sidney Lumet and Ridley Scott, but the project had struggled to get the green light due to the oftentimes metaphysical and spiritual nature of the story. But Adrian Lyne was hooked. He actually passed on the opportunity to direct the bestseller Bonfire of the Vanities and then hurled himself into this particular project. The final result, starring Tim Robbins, Elizabeth Pena, and Danny Aiello, was something very special, but also it was very difficult to market. While on the surface the movie might have horrifying ingredients that are very easy to exploit, like demonic creatures, intense paranoia, hallucinatory visions, and overt sexuality, the story is far more complex and challenging than your typical horror movie. What begins in the jungles of Vietnam, where a platoon of American soldiers endure a horrific and inexplicable experience, evolves into a delirious tale of heaven and hell, where structurally it can be pretty difficult to know what's real and what's not until the very end of the movie. The ambition of the film is absolutely incredible, but it left a lot of audience members totally scratching their heads. In one interview, writer Bruce Joel Rubin talks about how he attended an early screening where at the conclusion of the movie, an angry moviegoer stormed out of the theater stating, "If I ever meet the guy who wrote that movie, I'll kill him." Now, I won't claim that at age 14, I had a complete understanding of the film upon first viewing it, but I knew that I loved it. I was a little horror freak in the 1980s, but most of my diet consisted of relatively straightforward slasher movies. I had never seen anything that in such a compelling fashion had made me feel like I'd been to hell and survived to tell the tale. And looking back now, it's easy to point to it as one of the most vivid and powerful horror experiences of that period, and I'm not surprised that someone decided to remake it. For my part, on the whole, I'm utterly uninterested in remakes of classic movies from my childhood, whether you're talking about RoboCop or Total Recall or Jacob's Ladder. But if the new film encourages some folks to go back and visit the original, fantastic. It's one of those obscure horror movies that's always ripe for rediscovery. But I'm starting to think that's about as far as I can go without giving anything away. So hopefully at a bare minimum, I've stimulated your curiosity. But from here on out, I'm going to be doing the deep dive on specifics on why I love this film so dearly. So let's start with the overall story. The title of the film is borrowed from the book of Genesis, where Jacob sees a ladder leading up to heaven. But the structure of Jacob's Ladder and its framing device is inspired by both the short story and the short film, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Jacob's Ladder is a story that takes place almost entirely in between the brief period where Jacob Singer is bayoneted in the jungles of Vietnam and the moment where he finally makes his peace with death and leaves his life behind. But the process by which he comes to terms with his own death is absolutely fascinating, as angels or demons, depending upon how you look at them, take their turns tormenting and or helping him so that he can move on. What's beautiful from a storytelling point of view is how the writer leaves us a trail of breadcrumbs every step of the way and foreshadows so much of what Jacob will discover, from ominous signs in the subway about being in hell, to a palm reader casually joking to Jacob that he's already dead. In spite of the horrors the character endures along the way, the movie is eerily peaceful once we reach the final scene. I will admit that I think the movie doesn't 100% stick the landing in terms of the execution of the final few minutes, and that might have something to do with a few key scenes that were deliberately cut from the final third of the movie. But I've always been much more interested in flawed, ambitious films that are a little uneven than in those movies with no rough edges at all. As far as the deleted scenes are concerned, I'll talk more about them in a bit. For me, the real selling point of this film is how Adrian Lyne chose to portray the demonic creatures in the movie. In the original screenplay, the demons were conceived in a much more literal, traditionally biblical fashion with horns, wings, cloven hooves, much like in the paintings of William Blake. But Adrian Lyne worried that audiences would find it too easy to dismiss or laugh at traditional devils and demons, and he came up with a far more disturbing approach. Adrian Lyne's vision is much more grounded and organic, where he captures these horrors in camera, but barely gives us enough time to understand what we're seeing, allowing our imaginations to run wild, filling in the gaps. One of his key sources of inspiration came from the paintings of Francis Bacon. A perfect example is a scene where Jacob angrily confronts a nurse. Instead of horns sticking out of her head, we simply see this disgusting cancerous knot of bone protruding from the back of her head when her cap accidentally falls to the floor. We barely have time to see it before Jacob runs in terror, precisely the emotion that we're feeling. But most famous in this movie are the various stationary creatures whose heads appear to be moving at incomprehensible speeds, and these scenes are directly inspired by a famous photograph from 1976 by Joel Peter Witkin called Man with No Legs. What Lyne found most disturbing of the image was how the head appeared to be in motion and blurred in the image. For his film, Lyne achieved this effect by simply filming his actors at 4 frames per second and then playing it back at the typical speed of 24 frames per second. It's an incredibly effective technique, and anytime a filmmaker can capture an effect in camera without digital or optical effects, the final impact is always more powerful. No scene illustrates this better than Lyne's greatest contribution to the film, the scene where Jacob is quite literally transported into hell and told that he is in fact dead. This is a scene of pure visual storytelling, pure raw cinema. The scene is also a complete departure from the screenplay where Jacob is taken to a place called the Void. But I love how the scene begins harmless enough with a few orderlies transporting Jacob to another wing of the hospital, but slowly we start to realize that something is off, something's wrong. The floors are wet, they're disgusting, they're covered in debris, the walls and ceiling are starting to rot. One wheel of the gurney keeps spinning ominously, which is yet another brilliant touch by Lyne, who shortened one wheel on purpose, knowing that it would never quite hit the floor. And gradually we find ourselves in this horrific, insane asylum filled with misshapen creatures behind bars and prowling around the ceiling. And by the end of the journey, the halls are strewn with mangled, rotting body parts. And making it all the more terrifying is how calm and rational the doctors behave as Tim Robbins defiantly protests, "I'm alive." Apparently his performance was so compelling on the set that he ended up bringing several crew members to tears then and there. At this point, I do need to give a shout out to actor Tim Robbins. In 1990, he was in his absolute prime. While he'd been absolutely hysterical in movies like Bull Durham, he was about to begin a series of movies that I would argue are the best of his career. Movies like Robert Altman's The Player or Frank Darabont's Shawshank Redemption. Tim Robbins was just game for anything, and he completely sells each and every scene in Jacob's Ladder. When he's terrified, we believe it. When he's fighting for his life in a tub of ice with a fever of 106, we feel it. When he cries over the death of his son, it's heartbreaking. Also, by the way, his son's played by a very young Macaulay Culkin before Home Alone. And in a way, Tim Robbins saves the whole movie by not allowing it to tip over completely into the world of horror, by keeping certain scenes light. The way he dances when at a party, or the way he laughs when he's interacting with people on the street, or the way he flirts with Elizabeth Pena at work. It gives this movie some much needed mirth and levity. And speaking of Elizabeth Pena, she was never better. Whenever she's on screen, we're reminded that Lyne is the guy who gave us 9.5 Weeks. She is sizzling in this movie, and the more demonic she becomes, the more arousing is the overall effect of the scene. And another one of the most famous scenes of the movie, Jacob freaks out at a party while watching Pena's character Jesse first dancing and then eventually blatantly having sex with a demon in plain sight of everyone there. Pena is so uninhibited and so sexy in the scene, and once again, Lyne's insistence on capturing all the supernatural elements in camera gives the scene a vividness that can't be understated. But as long as I'm discussing performances, the whole cast really deserves a shout out, from Ving Rhames to Eric LaSalle to Jason Alexander, but the biggest scene stealer of them all has to be Danny Aiello, in one of his gentlest performances as he explains to Jacob why he feels like demons are ripping his life apart. Or at least Danny Aiello is gentle until he decides to rescue Jacob from a hospital that he considers to be barbaric. At that moment, he absolutely lets his volcanic personality make its presence known. What's incredible is just how much of the script was inspired by screenwriter Bruce Joel Rubin's own life. As a young film student at NYU in the early 60s, he made the very wise decision of consuming an entire eyedropper filled with LSD. His subsequent trip was so intense that for a time after, he felt like he no longer existed and wondered how he managed to return to real life from this void. But a voice in his head told him that his purpose was now to share what he saw. But then in 1980, he had this vivid dream about being trapped in the subway at night, and he officially had the start of Jacob Singer's journey. I think what trips some people up with this movie is trying to debate if the movie's a drug-fueled hallucination or an actual conflict over a man's soul. And for me, the film works just fine as both at the same time. Some might argue that the story of drugging U.S. soldiers in Vietnam in order to heighten their aggression, that perhaps it works a little bit too well as a red herring, especially with the major information dump about what happened to Jacob and his friends right at the end of the film. Originally, the scene led to a now deleted scene where Jacob decides to take a cure for the drug ladder, and he ends up having this intense hallucination of a demon ripping through the ceiling. I've seen the scene in isolation, and I think removing it may have been a mistake. Adrian Lyne has spoken publicly many times about the test screenings for the film and how early audience members walked out of the movie almost like dead people, completely obliterated, and he felt like this final scene was perhaps just one horror too many. But without the scene, as the movie stands, I think some people justifiably feel like the movie never really provides an emotional peak or an emotional climax to the story, making it difficult to accept how the movie very quietly draws to a close. But if you're curious, all the deleted scenes are readily available online. So the more I talk about this movie, the more I realize how ready I am for a little 90s nostalgia craze. We've been so inundated with 80s nostalgia as of late through shows like Stranger Things that I'm frankly sick to death of that era. But the 90s were an interesting time for me. As someone who was born in 1976, the 90s basically covered my life from my early teens through my early 20s, a period in everyone's life where the music we listened to, the games we played, the books we read, and the movies we watch just seemed to have so much more importance in shaping who we become as people. I'm not trying to oversell Jacob's Ladder's importance to me, but it was definitely one of those crucial transition films between childhood and adolescence where my taste in movies became a little more adventurous, and having just revisited the film yesterday, I can safely say the hallucinatory, intoxicating power of Jacob's Ladder has never faded for me. So if you're a fan of the movie, I hope you've enjoyed my little sentimental journey back to this film. I definitely plan on doing a lot more of these kinds of videos in the future. Also, before I wrap up, if you're a fan of my podcast, Wrong Reel, I wanted to give you a heads up that I'm now selling merchandise related to Wrong Reel, and there's a link in the video notes below. If you've never heard my podcast, there's a link to that as well. But I think I've said all I have to say about Jacob's Ladder. If you want to talk more about this movie or about horror or whatever, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrex. But please do me a favor, hit the like button on this video. Please consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. But thanks so much for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.